Hi everyone. In this video I am going to explain cloning concept in Java. Okay, this is one of the interview question. So I am going to explain in detail about this concept. After watching this video you will get good knowledge on the cloning concept. Okay, the interviewer will ask what is the default cloning. So basically first we will understand what is cloning and what are the types of cloning available in Java. Okay, first basically cloning is nothing but creating a copy of an object, but generally people think that when you pass a reference to, or when you create an employee object and if you assign that reference to another reference variable, people generally think that that is called copying. But the problem is when you assign a reference to another reference, if you modify the object, that will modify the original object. So basically that is not at all a copy. When you assign a reference to another reference variable, that is both pointing to original object only, so it's not in creating a copy at all. So first we will check one by one. See, basically what I have done is I have created an employee. It is having an employee number instance variable, a string buffer. String buffer means about the employee, what is about the employee, this string buffer. Okay, and address is another class. Okay, what address will contain what is the city of that employee, what is the state of that employee. So created two classes. Okay, now what I have done, I have taken a program. Okay, I have created an employee object. So in employee I created a constructor which takes employee number, string buffer and address. So I can create an address and initialize all these things using this parameterized constructor. Okay, that's what I have done here. I am creating an employee with employee number 100, and about this employee I created a string buffer and passing that the means about that person. This is Venkat, and I created address. Hyderabad is his city and Andhra Pradesh is his state. Okay, so I created the employee. Okay, then I printed the values. Okay, then I called a method. Okay, I passed this reference to another method. Okay, this reference will be passed to this one. Generally what people think is it creates a copy. No, it won't create a copy. So if Venkat points to an employee object 100, this bad copy also points to the original object. So if you modify anything in this method, that will modify the contents in the original object. That is bad, right? Actually my intention is just passing this object just to use that, but what can happen if that method modifies the values, that will affect the original object. But I don't want like that. I want to pass the copy of the object, and if any modifications are done here, it should not reflect the original object. That is called actually the real copy, not sending the reference like this. If you send reference like this, this will not create a copy. It will just create another reference variable which points to the original object in the heap. So that is called, so that's why see now after I creating the employee, I passed that reference to another object. In that object I am modifying the values, and after calling that method I am printing the values. Actually my intention is it should not change, but when you pass a reference like this, this will modify the original object also. Let us see, run as Java application. Can you see? Actual original employee number is 100. Original description is this is Venkat. Address is Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh. Okay. Now see, when I modify something in this method, that is modifying the original object. This is Venkat. Okay, original description. See, this is Venkat bad print employee values. So when I append to the description, this is affecting the original object also. Okay, for now, for example, actually I did not change anything address. If you change anything at city or city or state here, that will modify the original object also. Okay, if you want I can make that show you also. When you pass a reference to another method, actually it creates another reference which points to the original object, so a new employee won't be created. So now see, we will run again. Can you see, when I modify city in this bad print employee values method, okay, I modified the city and state in this method. So what happened? The original object is modified. Can you see, after the method call I am printing the same object. Now everything is changed, so the original object is getting modified. So I should not allow this to happen. Actually my intention is to passing to this method is just to use that, but if some modification happen, this is modifying the original object. I don't want that to happen. So you want to create a copy so that when you modify something here, that should not affect the original object. So what I have to do, you can do like this. So in that method, what you can do is you create a new employee object, okay, and set the employee number and about employee using the values from the object that is passed to this method. So what I am doing, instead of modifying this, I am copying the values in good copy into good employee. Okay, so I created a new employee object. So what will happen now, if I modify this object, if I modify the employee number and about me, this won't modify the original object because I am creating a new employee but with the values of the original object. Got it? So now we will change this method. Now see what happens. Earlier everything is modified when you modify in this method, right? But see the difference now. Can you see? 100 is as it is. This is Venkat. It is not modified. Okay. But remember, employee number is not modified, but can you see, description is still modified. This is Venkat, modifying the original object. So in the here also, when I get the good copy that get about employee and set it to the new employee, for primitives it is working, but when you assign the reference, this about employee description still points to the original object. But when you copy the primitive, when you create a new employee and copy the primitive, and if you change the primitive, it is not modifying. But when you copy the reference as it is, the reference will be copied to the new employee. So when you modify this string buffer, this is still affecting the original object. Actually, this is called shallow copying. Okay, now we will see in picture. I have created a picture. It will give you good understanding. So this is the original object. Original object, what it contains? An employee number, a string buffer. What is the string buffer? It is a reference point into this string buffer, and it contains a reference address reference. It points to an object in the heap. This object contains what? Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh. This string buffer contains what? This is Venkat. Okay, so this is the original object. The primitive value will be here, right? But this contains the reference. So this reference points to an object. So this reference string buffer points to an object in the memory. This address reference points to an object in the heap, right? This address reference points to an object. So when you perform shallow copying, okay, shallow copying means this is what I have done. I have created the new employee and I copied this 100 value to here. Okay, it is fine. So when you modify the 100, it won't affect the original object because this 100 value is different and this 100 value is different. And then what I have done, I have copied the reference as it is to here. This is what I have done, right? I have copied the reference string buffer reference into the new employee. So what happens, whatever the reference here, so it will be copied here. So what will happen, it won't be a copy. This reference, since you copied as it is, this will still point to this reference, means this about employee description string buffer still points to the original object. So what happens after creating a copy, the original object is pointing to this string buffer, and the new object, that in the new object there is a reference to string buffer, right? That is also pointing to the original object. There is no problem with primitive, but when you copy the reference manually, this still points to original object. So if you modify the string buffer in the cloned object, that will affect the original object. Okay, now what you have done, then you have copied the address reference to the new reference. So this address also points to the original address. So from the copy object, if you modify the city and state, that will modify this city and this state. So this is called shallow copying. Shallow copying means when you copy the primitives, there won't be any problem. But when you copy the references, okay, the references still point to the original object. Assume this is a 1000, this points to a string buffer in the heap. Assume this is address reference is 2000, this points to a object in the heap. So when you copy 1000 and 2000 into the new object, this 1000 and 2000 still point to the original object because you just copied the reference variables. So this is called shallow copying. In deep copying, actually here I have manually created a new employee object and copied the employee number and copied the string buffer, right? Instead of that, Java provides a clone method in the object class. So instead of you manually creating the new employee object and copying, if you say clone employee, suppose if you want to create a copy of this object, right, then what you have to do, you have to call the clone method. Okay, but to call the clone method, the object should implement the marker interface called clonable. Can you see? Only if your class implements this marker interface, then only you can call the clone method. See, marker interface means it won't have any methods, but it is an instruction to JVM that when you call the clone method, my object is eligible for cloning. If you don't implement, JVM says no, this object cannot be cloned. So it is just like indicating that my object can be cloned. That is what the purpose of implementing the marker interface. Then what you have to do, see, the clone method comes from the object class. Okay, that is a protected in object. So what you have to do is, when you want to call the clone method from outside the package, you should have the make it public. Otherwise, if it is a protected, you cannot call from outside the package, right? I am calling this clone method in the employee2 from the another package. Actually, where is this employee2? Here it is, but my class is here. It is in another package. So make this as public so that clone method can be accessible. So you have to override. What I am doing, just I call, okay, return super.clone. Okay, so the default cloning is called shallow copying, as I said, like this. Instead of you creating the new employee object, see, earlier what I have done, I myself manually creating another employee and copying the employee number into the new object, string buffer content into the new object. Instead of that, I suppose, what if there are 1000 instance variables? It will be very tough, right? You have to copy 1000 values from this object to the new object. That will be time consuming. Instead of that, Java by default supports clone. The clone, when you call super.clone, so it is called shallow copying. Shallow copying means, what will happen when you say good copy.clone, it will create a new employee object. Okay, when you call clone method employee.clone, then what will happen, a new employee object will be created like this, and all these values, okay, this value will be copied here, this value will be copied here, this value will be copied here. So this is called shallow cloning. When you call the, I am repeating, just instead of this I am creating another one just to make you understand. When you call clone method, what will happen is, okay, internally a new employee object will be, a new employee object will be created, and the employee number will be copied here in the new object. The reference means, assume it is 1000, this will be copied here, and this assume it is 2000, this 2000 will be copied here. So when you do the shallow copying, primitives will not have any problem, because this 100 will be copied here. So if you modify the primitive, it won't affect the original object. But since you copy the references 1000 and 2000, so 1000 and 2000 still point to these original objects. So in the shallow cloning, if you modify the references of the new object, that will affect the original object, but primitives won't be a problem. So what you have to understand, when your class doesn't contain any reference variables, then shallow cloning is okay, no problem, it will create a copy. But if you have references to another class objects, then shallow cloning doesn't create a exact copy, because these references still point to the original object, right? So in shallow copying, since you are copying the references, if you modify these references, that will affect the original object. So in shallow cloning, the problem with shallow cloning is the references are copied as it is. So when you modify these references, original objects will be affected. So So when you have the references to another class objects, then what you have to do is you have to implement deep cloning. Okay, shallow cloning means nothing. Your class employee TO should implement clonable. Okay, then override the method the clone and just call return super.clone. Means the super.clone by default it is shallow cloning. Make this public, because since you are trying to access that, by default it is protected. The object class declares it as protected. So if you want to call the clone outside of the package, then you have to make that as public. Okay, so super, when you say super.clone, this returns shallow cloning. The disadvantage of shallow cloning is when you have a references to another class objects, if you modify the objects in the new object, the original object get affected. So what you have to do is you have to create a deep copy. How to create a deep copy means, can you see? Earlier what I have done, I have created I just created the shallow cloning. The problem with shallow cloning is the references still point to the original object. So I have to modify. So I have to create deep copy. That means I have to create a new string buffer, because string buffer is not having a clone method. That is declared as protected. I cannot change that. That's why I am creating a new string buffer with the content in this original object. So what will happen? Instead of this, I am creating a new string buffer. I'm creating a new string buffer. So now this reference won't point to original object. I'm creating a new string buffer, okay, and pointing this to another string object. Okay, earlier what is happening? This reference is pointing to original object because you just copied. But now what I am doing is first call the shallow, first use normally. So this will create shallow cloning. So now I have to modify the references to point to another reference. If the original reference is 1000, I should when you create a shallow cloning, this is 1000, but I don't want this to be 1000. I am creating a new string buffer and I will copy this content. Okay, I will just copy this content to here. So now what will happen? This is a new object. So if you modify the content here, this will not affect the original object. Now in the same way, what I have done, I made my address class implements the clonable, so that I can call the clone method. Now when you call the, so into new object, instead of copying the original address, what I am doing, I am saying good copy dot get address dot clone. Now what will happen? So it will create another object, right? When you call the clone on address, what will happen? It will create another object. Okay, when you call here in this line, what I am doing, original copy get address, means it will give the address, and I am calling the clone method on that address, and that will return a copy, create a copy of the address, right? That address I am assigning to the new object. Then what will happen? A new address will be created. Okay, then city, state. Now what I am doing, when you In earlier 2000 is as it is copied, so it still points to original object. Now what I am doing, I am getting this address object, by calling original object dot get address, and I am calling the clone method. Then what will happen? A new object will be created, and this address reference doesn't point to original object. Now what will happen? This address will point to new address. See, this reference won't be there, unlike shallow cloning. Now can you see 100? If you change 100, it won't affect because this is a new value, and if you modify this reference, this won't modify the original object because I created a new string buffer. So when you modify this, this is not pointing to original string buffer. So if you make modifications in deep cloning, it won't affect. So, and for address reference, what I have done, I called the get address from the original object and called clone method. So your address also should implement the clonable, otherwise you will get exception. Then what I'm doing, I create, when you call the clone object on the original get address, this will create a new object. It will copy the city and the state from this. Hyderabad will come here. When you call address.clone, Hyderabad will come here and Andhra Pradesh will come here. So this is an entirely new object. So when you modify this object, it won't modify because this is not pointing to a new object. Earlier this address is pointing to original object, but now if you see, the employee reference is pointing to new object and address reference is pointing to new object. These are not pointing to original objects. So you have to perform deep cloning when you have references, because in shallow cloning references will be copied as it is, so they will point to original object, and so if you make the modifications, original object will get modified. So you have to create deep copy. Deep copy means these references should not point to original objects. They have to create new, for references new objects has to be created, and this reference should point to new objects instead of these old objects. In deep cloning you have to create new objects and point this reference to that new string buffer and point this address to new address. This is called deep cloning. Now see again the code. In what, first I have to call the clone method. Then what it will happen, it will give the shallow copy. So if you have 100 instance variables, like suppose in this example I have only employee number, right? So if you have some 100 instance variables, okay, this line will create a new employee object and copies all those 100 variables and the references, right? But the references will be a problem, so I am making those references pointing to new objects in deep cloning. How I am achieving that? By calling the reference dot clone. Then what will happen? A new object will be created and this reference will point to new object instead of original object. This is called deep cloning. You have to perform steps like this. For references, you have to get the good copy dot get about employee. This will create a reference, right? You have to call the clone method. In string buffer, for string buffer also you can call the clone method, but I think in string buffer clone is protected, so you cannot change the class, right? Address is the class I have written, so I made this as implement clonable. But okay, but to call the a clone in the string buffer, since by default it will be protected, now I cannot change. In address I can change. I made it as public so that I can call the clone outside, but in string buffer I cannot modify this to protected, right? So what I have done, instead of calling the clone method, I have created a new string buffer and pointing the string buffer content from the original object to the new object. And for address I simply call, because I can modify the clone method to public and I can make my address implements clonable, right? So what I have done, I simply call the clone method. Then what will happen, it will create a new address object. Okay, and the original contents in the address Hyderabad Andhra Pradesh will be copied to here. So I'm pointing this address reference to new object, so that when you make changes in the new object, even if you change employee number now, employee description and address reference, this will not affect in any way these employee description string buffer, and this address won't be modified after deep cloning. This is called cloning concept. See, we will modify this. We will call this method deep cloning method, and see the values won't be changed. Can you see 100 after deep cloning? I tried to modify the description, I tried to modify the city, I tried to modify the state, but can you observe 100, it is not modified. Of course I didn't modify the employee number, but I tried to modify the description, city, state. But can you see, this is Venkat. See, this is, even after modifying, the original object is not modified, because after deep copying the reference variables point to new description and new address. So I modified to modified and modified state, but can you see the original city and state are not modified. This is called deep cloning. I will repeat, in shallow cloning the references will point to original object. When you call dot clone method, primitives and references will be copied, so the original references will be copied to the new object. So when you modify, the original object will be affected. So what you have to do in deep cloning, after you call the clone method, you have to call the clone method again for the reference variables also, so that the reference variable, that address object will be created, another object will be created, the values from original Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh will be copied, and this reference will now point to new object instead of original object. So if you make any changes, this will not affect the original objects. So this is called deep cloning. Okay, so to make, let us see, I will remove the clone of, I will remove this, and you will observe that you will get exception when I run this. So when you want to clone the object, remember you have to implement the clonable marker interface. If you don't implement clonable marker interface, when you call the clone method, okay, a runtime exception will be thrown. Can you see clone not supported exception occurred? So every object which has to be cloned should implement the clonable. I am removing the address. We are trying to clone the address also, right? Now it will say that address is not clonable. Run as Java application. Can you see, it is saying now address is not clonable. Okay, hope you understand. Thank you.